commercial-free Catholic Charismatic channel.
He's strengthening the faith of so many people.
To promote the gift of church teaching, dedicated for the new evangelization.
God's blessings on your work. May God bless and prosper you.
Shalom World, God's own channel.
Hi, good seeing you. Really wonderful. Thank you very much. And it is so good to have all of you here. I'm sure you remember a few Sundays ago when we had that famous passage from about St. Peter, how Jesus walked into the boat and they had fished the whole night, and then Jesus says, cast the net on the other side, and Peter catches a great show of fish, and then what happens to Peter after that? So I was reading this passage and I said, come on, this one passage, it has to be taken in the context of everything that happened in Peter's life. And as a matter of fact, I read all what happened in Peter's life. There are different pieces in different parts of the gospel. And what I found was amazing to me. And that's what I like to talk to you about this morning. Our life as believers, and all of us are believers, so our life as believers is not a finished product. We are always on a journey. And I think keeping that in mind is going to add certain things to us, and that's what I like to share with you this morning. I'm Father Joe Thaneker, and I'm so pleased to be able to share this whole concept with you this morning. So, looking at Peter's life, what I have found is, there are certain moments in Peter's life with Jesus, and there is a certain movement in his relationship with Jesus, and that's what I really found. So the first thing that is mentioned in the gospel is Peter's brother Andrew comes and invites him. Come, we have found someone who could be the Messiah, come and join us. And Peter goes with him. So that's probably the very first time. And as soon as he reaches over there, Jesus has this great welcome words. He says, here comes somebody, and he recognizes him. They have a very good conversation, and so on and so forth. And then later, you find Peter carrying on to live with Jesus. But then, a particular day, Jesus asks the question, what do you disciples hear about me? What do people say I am? And none of them say anything, and Peter is the first one who speaks. Peter says, Lord, you are the Messiah. You are the Son of God. Now, if that's too fast according to me, how does anyone say something like that about Jesus in such a quick notice? I mean, a couple of months maybe might have passed, and so on. But then Jesus takes him for his word, and he praises him for what he says, and so on. But what happens is soon after there is a test. And on the 6th of August, we celebrated the Transfiguration. Transfiguration is when Jesus, with two of these disciples, they walk up the mountain, and there Jesus is transfigured. And Peter's reaction is very interesting. He again is the first to react, and he says, Lord, this is wonderful, let us stay here, and so on. Now, Jesus says, no, this is not the place we are supposed to be staying. We are supposed to go down the mountain. And so they walk down the mountain. Now, incidentally, if you remember, prior to this, there was another very important interaction. After Peter had actually given a witness to who Jesus was, you are the Son of God, etc., Jesus ventures out sharing with the disciples, you know what? Yes, you say I am the Son of God, but I'm going to have to suffer. And you know the reaction of Peter over there? Peter says, no, this cannot happen to you. How can you suffer? How can, no, suffering is not a thing. And Jesus reacts very strongly to him. So the transfiguration experience comes after this. And we carry on with Peter, and Peter is taking a very important role in the group now. And he takes leadership in many different ways, and so on and so forth. And finally, we come to Gethsemane. And in Gethsemane, you know what happened? When Jesus was being, sort of going to be arrested and so on, Peter takes out his sword and cuts off the ear of the one of the persons who were there, and Jesus orders him, put your sword back, and he puts his sword back and so on. Very strange, no, for a believer in Jesus and so on to take the sword and to defend Jesus to that extent. I would say it's a streak of violence in Peter's life. And soon after that, Jesus is arrested, and then we have the betrayal sequence. We read about that in the Passion and so on, how he betrayed Jesus, a loyalty question. And then after that, of course, he starts crying. He grief, sorry for what he has done, and so on and so forth. And the next incident is after the resurrection, and we know how Jesus gave a special appearance to Peter after the resurrection. And as a result, somehow we don't find any more Peter failing in anything. Instead, Jesus and Peter going along very beautifully. Jesus entrusts to him. Finally, there is a conversation about, do you love me? Remember, 3 times Jesus asked Peter, and each time he says, I love you, etc. And finally, Peter sort of assumes responsibility for the community, and that goes without any problem till the end of his life, till he lays down his life for Jesus. Now, what I have done is just to spread some of the incidents that are narrated in the gospel, but I think we have to notice certain things. So, for example, that catch of the fish we start with, it's like Peter understood fish. This is a whole lot of fish that he did not expect. Yeah, okay, he felt attracted to Jesus. It is something like, I am ready to be a disciple of Jesus for the material good things that come its way. It is a good way of being with Jesus. But then he moves on. When Jesus actually shares with him that the Son of Man has to suffer, he says, no. Discipleship, yes, but no suffering. So the first was discipleship with certain amount of material advantages, and later when it comes to the suffering, he says no, which means Peter has to get beyond that question. His discipleship at that stage was deficient in the fact that he could not accept suffering. He had to get beyond that. So there is a certain level of growth that is expected from a material level to a spiritual level, to a change of understanding of the role of suffering in Jesus' life. Then the transfiguration experience. He finally saw for a few moments what that bliss is like, and he says, let us settle here. Jesus says, no, your faith should not be something that takes you away from the reality of life. Your faith should be right in the reality of life, and so on. That was another invitation to Peter to get out of his own thinking that faith can be lived without any reference to reality of life. And then finally, when we come to the Gethsemane thing, Jesus challenges him, Peter, get rid of your violence. And then eventually we come to the loyalty question. So Peter is undergoing a change within himself. There is a growth that is taking place in the relationship with Jesus. I would like to reflect on this in the next segment, and we are going to conclude this, but then we'll come back in a few minutes, and then we will see what this means for us in our life, etc. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So, as we finished saying before we went out for a break, Peter had to pass through certain stages in his own relationship with Jesus. He had to grow into it, in a sense, grow from a very kind of immature faith to a mature faith. And so, for example, first his faith was like more materially based. I mean, he liked the catch of fish. But then afterwards, he had to pass through the whole idea of re-understanding suffering. And later, on the Mount Tabor, he had to factor in the fact that faith cannot be divested from life. We cannot simply say, I believe, and then shut ourselves away from actual problems of life, actual daily life issues, and so on. And then he had to confront his violent self. There was a streak of violence in him, and we can understand a fisherman fighting with the elements every day, We can understand that, but he had to overcome that in his relationship with Christ, and then move on to the question of loyalty, solid loyalty. Love means staying with him through thick and thin, and he had to grow into that and so on, and eventually he had to profess his life. So there is a journey in Peter's life. You know, that day when I was looking at this, my inspiration was this, that all of us are called to this kind of a journey. It's not a question of simply accepting some beliefs and saying, I'm a Christian. That is not what Peter had some beliefs, but he had to revise all those beliefs. He had to streamline his daily lifestyle according to the new beliefs. And that is kind of what we are called to do, I believe. And this is the kind of a key model that I would like to explore in all these series of talks that we are going to have. In other words, can we chalk out a journey for the believer? That will be the question that we shall examine little by little, point by point. I think this is helpful because I have seen lots of families, especially when their youngsters grew up, they start asking questions, and then you have parents feeling rattled and saying, what is happening to my son, my daughter? They are asking all kinds of questions and so on and so forth. Well, from this, if you look at Peter, then we needn't be worried, because questions, and we know questions show an eagerness to learn. So for parents, for example, to learn, how can I steer the questions to an exploration of reality? That may be the kind of challenge that we have to face and so on. So not to feel rattled when people ask questions. Another reflection I had was, we should somehow in our catechetical efforts help our people to move from an immature faith to a mature faith. And that is a crucial thing. Now, if we look at catechism teaching, for example, catechism teaches the basic minimum. It tells them about what we believe and so on and so forth. But people have to eventually discover these things for themselves. And I would like to invite you to think about your own life, my own life. I think we had to go through that stage. Catechism learning was only a small phase in the beginning. Later, we integrated all this into life, and then we had our own understandings, our own formulations. So that's the kind of model that I would like to really explore in these series of these talks. So to help us out in this, I think we are going to deal with a couple of topics during the coming these series of talks that we are talking about. So for example, I would like to say something about our understanding of ourselves. So that's what changed in Peter, his understanding of himself and his understanding of Peter, of Jesus. So every Christian has to re-understand himself or herself. And so that is why I'd like to at least give maybe 2 segments to the whole idea of who are we, the self that we carry with us, and how the scriptures enhance that understanding. Of course, the human sciences have much to contribute to that, but what I have found is what the scripture says about these things is a crowning of all that. And therefore, it is good, I think, for us to go into that kind of a thing. So basic thing would be, first of all, journey to the self. Life in the spirit or growing as a faithful person would mean a journey into the self. And a second, as a result of this journey into the self, we really cannot grow into the self unless we discover God within. So that takes us to a journey to God. So the second main part would be journey to God. And journey to God will really consist of looking at prayer in the lives of people, lives of believers and so on. And then also looking at our ordinary life. So for example, I would like to call it spirituality of the ordinary life. I mean, if we expect our spiritual life to be always exceptional, and we know from our experience that is not the way it is. We have to find the spirit within an ordinary life. So that, I think, is very much part of journey to God. And once we have sort of examined journey to God, I think God and I together, we travel into the world. Therefore, it's a journey to the world, which means also what we do for the world, how do we interpret the world, how do we understand the world around us, how can we influence the world. And there also we will touch, for example, how do we meet the world and how do we speak to the world. And I think in today's context, for example, if religions could speak more to each other, how beautiful it would be. And we are today running into so many issues because there are so many religions, and religions somehow have not, I feel, refined the art of talking to one another. And as a result, we make mistakes, there's a lot of tension and so on. I think it's a big thing that we need to do, especially as Catholics and Christians and so on. If we take Jesus as the model, that's what he did. So I'd like to explore that. In other words, how do we journey into the world? So for example, our vocations. All of us are called to some kind of a vocation. It's our way of being in the world, vocation. Then, for example, how do we encounter the world? How do we meet the world? How do we evangelize? We use that word so often. But in this new understanding, how do we evangelize? Everybody agrees we have to evangelize. Our differences may be in how we want to do it. And I think that is something to be looked at. And then Jesus has given us this beautiful way of going into the world with forgiveness. That I think is one of the religious contribution to relating with the world, forgiveness and so on. So basically these are some of the topics that we will deal with, and I really look forward to these talks and hope that we will be able to explore them together. When we come back, we will see what your reactions, some of your reactions would be, responses would be, maybe if you have some questions, maybe if you have something to contribute, and in that way we can enrich the little presentation that I have made. And so right now we will see how we can do that. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. We are in the third segment of this little presentation this morning, and right now we'll have some responses, reactions, possibly some questions, and we'll see how we can share about that. Matt?
Hi, Father Joe. My name is Matt Reddy, and my is more of a reaction response to the session just now. I was very impressed or very much enjoyed the sort of the journey on Peter and Jesus's relationship. I know a lot about it, but never had it sort of put in that kind of sequence where you showed Peter and his initial reaction with Jesus in the sort of the reward stage of the fish, and then going through the turmoil, the violence, and then finally coming out the other end. So just very, very, very much enjoyed it, and never had it thought of it that way.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Incidentally, yesterday I was watching on the YouTube, there was a little discussion, a good debate actually, discussion with Christopher Hitchens and some of the other pastors and so on. And one of them particularly focused on faith as a relationship with Christ. And he was really to the point, I think. Faith is really not so much about what we believe, etc., but it's about a relationship. And the moment we say relationship, it is about growth in a relationship. It's not a static stay in one place. And I'm glad you have raised that point very much. And I'm sure we'll get some more opportunities to really focus on that, faith as the relationship with Christ.
All right. Thank you, Father.
That grows and moves. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.
Hi, Father Joe. I'm Tim. I have a comment, and then I'll end it with a question. And it has to do specifically with the episode in the garden where Peter pulls his sword and strikes one of the temple guards. It strikes me that it was not a surprise to Jesus at that moment that Peter was carrying a sword. Probably all the disciples were carrying swords, possibly, because then as now it was a lawless time and they were moving from village to village, a lot of brigands, thieves, all they had to defend themselves. So it struck me that perhaps in light of the long Catholic tradition of the right to self-defense and just war, that perhaps Jesus was saying at that moment violence was not appropriate to defend ourselves at that place and time. Yeah. So how would you put that in the context of the right to self-defense and to just war theory?
Wow, and that is a tough question because we all know the implications of what you... thanks for raising it. It's really a great question, I think. My own take is I would like to go back to what Jesus said to Peter after Peter had used the sword. He says, Peter, put back your sword in its sheath, for those who take sword will die by the sword. He says that. So to some extent it tells me that Jesus is placing this as the ideal. That means kind of no violence, that violence is no way to resolve a question. But he's putting it as the ideal. And we all know there are so many situations where we don't know what to do. And that is why the church had for a long time the just war kind of a theory and so on. But probably Jesus is saying still remains as a challenge for humanity. Do we have what it takes to move to a situation where we can give up violence? Any kind of a violent solution. Of course, violence for its own sake is absolutely, but a violent solution where violence is rampant and so on. But anyway, it's a bigger question, and I think we have to sort of keep thinking about it and looking at what the church has to offer and so on, so forth. Yeah. Thanks for the question.
All right,
it's really
thank
wonderful. You. Yeah. I really like that both the responses had highlighted the question of journey, and I, for one, like this whole question of life as journey and relationship as a journey. And I remember when I was working in a parish, we had our youngsters growing up, and they finished the 8th grade, and they were going off to school and college later. After 2 years, one of these boys came back. He was studying in a Protestant university by now, I think, yeah. And he was coming back because he had an experience there. Some of the things that were taught there to him in the religion class did not fit with what he had been taught here. And so he was coming back to ask, but Father, what do we do now? We are being taught like this. I think we could answer that question in 2 ways. One is to say they are wrong, we are right, black and white, and so on. But would that have really resolved his problem? He has to go back to his friends, he had to go back to his own class, he had to go back to and live with them and all that. So anyway, I gave him an answer like this. I said, you know, I don't remember his name, but I said, you know, you've got 2 legs. And both the legs are meant to walk. It is not meant to stay in one place. That's true also in your life of faith. We've got to walk. We are not meant to stay in one place. And when you walk, you've got 2 legs, which means with one leg you can stay firm in what you believe. With the other, you can explore. You can explore, and nobody prevents us from exploring the depth of our faith. What does our faith mean in a given situation? Say, for example, in today's world of multi-religious context, any country we go to, it is a multi-religious context. And I don't know if you agree with me if I were to say that one of the big problems in today's world is this multi-religious context. We don't seem to know, as we said before, we don't seem to know how to talk to one another. And in that context, any desire to understand the other is a precious movement of the Spirit as far as I can see. Any desire in our heart to really open ourselves to explore what lies beyond what we already know. I think it is not only a human right, not only a right given to us by who we are, but it is a necessary way to mature in one's own faith. When we get to know other people, that adds new dimensions to what we know of our faith. We find newer ways of understanding our faith. So I'm not here to say our faith can be put out there for anybody to say whatever they like. That's not what I mean. We hold our faith precious and strongly, but that's one foot. With the other foot, let us explore. And exploration is a good way to get closer to God, because every time we get closer to the truth, we are getting closer to God. And I'd like to stop today on that. And thank you once again for coming. It was really very nice talking to you. And so we will, I hope, see you next week. And it'll be all right. Yeah? Okay? Thank you. Yeah, that's right. Very good. Thank you.
Shalom Tidings. This is good news for a new generation. Discover God's constant presence amidst the hopelessness in our lives. Tiffany Layton writes about losing her young husband to horrific violence in Clinging to the Cross. God's grace showed Anne Noel how to be a merciful woman. Brother Manis Matus tells us why misery, pain, and suffering can indeed be a gift. Lisa Duffy shares her experiences in escaping the dangers of the divorce culture. Patty Knapp understands the infinite value of having a mass said, and so much more. Read about how God gives hope for the heartbroken in the February-March 2015 issue of Shalom Tidings. Visit shalomworld.org/tidings. Also available in Barnes & Noble stores